what are your most bang for the buck applications of Neubie in terms of pad placements, exercise? Like where are you using it to see the most benefit?
Restoring the center of mass, having someone understand with Neubie pad placements what it feels like to be centered. And I think the easiest way to do that is with this model of compression and expansion.
I'm Garrett Salpeter, and I believe that the most powerful and transformative way to help people recover from pain and injury, heal from trauma, and reach their highest levels of fitness and performance is to focus on the nervous system. In this podcast, we'll share knowledge from the frontiers of neuroscience and inspirational stories of how applying that knowledge has empowered people from all walks of life to heal, adapt, and grow.
Welcome back to the NeuFit Undercurrent podcast. I am joined today by my good friend Bert Massey, who you may remember from episode 35, and also if you have seen our athletic performance course as part of our continuing education curriculum for practitioners using the Neubie. He was my collaborator on that course as well. And in episode 35, we talked, a lot about the contents of the course. We're going to revisit some similar topics, some, adjacent, related, but different topics as well. And the reason we're doing this right now is because this is being released as episode 87, and it's a fast follow right after episode 86, which happened with Dr. Pat Davidson. So if you haven't listened to that yet, I encourage you to listen to that as well, because he talks a lot about these movement principles, like the sensory motor competencies in each of the three planes of movement, for example, and talks about, his whole system for organizing movement. And, it's very, very information rich, really wonderful paradigm. It's changed improved my understanding of movement and biomechanics in a very meaningful way. And, give Bert credit because Bert introduced me to his content, and he's been encouraging me for a while, and I've just been, so busy, had a million other things going on, didn't, finally dove in, right?
Yes.
And you were right.
Better late than never. Better late than never, man. Better late than never.
And you are also the owner of Grounded Strength.
Yes, sir.
Here in Austin, Texas.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Owner of Grounded Strength, actually minted owner since the last podcast.
That's right.
So we now have, if you like the athletic development course, anything like that, in addition to your Neubie headquarters, there is a place here in Austin now that is dedicated specifically to these processes that we'll be talking about today that we practice every single day with general population, athletes, anyone that comes in.
And it's cool. So you and Chris.
Yes.
And you got another, are the strength coaches. You
got another one. Yeah, we got Paul now too. We got
and
Paul
then
now too.
what's the guy's name who's the chiropractor?
Jason.
Yeah.
Jason. Yes.
It's they've got a really cool thing going on here. So I'm excited to dive in. Glad you're back on the show.
Me too. I love this. This is my wheelhouse. As I told you, you just wing it, and this is my everyday, man.
Awesome. So in the episode with Dr. Pat, we talked about he talked about his 7-pillar model, which he believes, and I agree, gets really close to a unified theory of exercise science. And in the pillars are things like movement, motor patterns, right? So
right.
Controlling the thoracic, breathing,
Mm-hmm.
controlling the pelvis, locomotion,
Mm-hmm.
push, pull,
Mm-hmm.
etc.
I'm not going to list them because
yeah.
I don't remember them
Those all
right off the top of my head.
There's 13.
Yes.
So there's that, and then there's movement strategies like compression and expansion.
Yes.
And then there's eccentric and concentric orientation. Yes. And then there's this notion of ground. So we're going to get into it. But let's specifically drill down into this pillar of sensory motor competencies in the three planes of movement, because I think this will probably be a good segue into this. I really want to start off with talking with you about actually one more comment before we get into that. So most of the time we start off with mapping with the Neubie, right? We're scanning around, finding hot spots where the nervous system is guarding, inhibiting, where there's hypersensitivity that could lead to chronic pain even after an injury is healed. And then we often talk about how once you've worked through hot spots, then you can use your knowledge of kinesiology, exercise science. You can work on programming muscles to contract or lengthen, sometimes at the same time on other sides of the joint. You can kind of get into this more neuromuscular reeducation form of training, programming the nervous system,
Right.
causing, for example, the glute to contract as the anterior hip lengthens, having different frequencies on something like that. So there's these different things, different strategies you can take with the Neubie, really using it as if you're programming the software of the nervous system for more efficient movement.
Yes, correct.
And so to frame that up, then, after or outside of mapping, what are your most bang for the buck, highest bang for the buck applications of Neubie in terms of pad placements, exercise? Like where are you using it to see the most benefit, especially in light of these conversations with Pat and that other podcast?
I think the biggest thing that I accomplish the most with is this concept that, if you've listened to the Pat podcast, he talked about taking special populations and putting them in either general population, back to general population, or back to athletic population. The thing that I have found
So just to pause there. So special population would be someone who's coming in with an injury,
correct,
or some sort of condition,
correct,
and then you're trying to essentially recover them back
right.
into, so they can become either a general fitness client or
Right.
if they're an athlete, an athletic.
Yeah, and I mean,
right?
this is my wheelhouse. Like, I'm not a physical therapist. I'm not a chiropractor. People come to me in different stages of their condition. So I would say, to answer your question more directly, restoring the center of mass, having someone understand with Neubie pad placements what it feels like to be centered. And I think the easiest way to do that is with this model of compression and expansion. So with compression and expansion, you have the coming down, the forwards in the compression, and then expansion coming up. The exhalation on the compression, the inhalation on the expansion. That sounds to me a lot like a squat. And so my big bang for the buck movements, pad placements with Neubie are the things that I need to do to restore someone to as good of a squat as they can get. And I would say, minus the scenario where there's bone on bone, no cartilage in knees, a lot of knee pain, actual problems to get down to that level, I'm going to restore the squat. That's my big bang for the buck movement. And my pad placements are going to be things like VMO, things like upper abs, so that we can pull the sternum closer together, maybe try to change that infrasternal angle through some breathing strategies. I think that's my big bang for the buck. And I loved in the Pat podcast that you guys just did, he talked about how, and this is my world, where if you're in personal training, someone wants to know, they have an expectation of what that looks like. And if I spend a bunch of time laying on the ground doing his breathing drills with someone, that's a lot harder to get them to buy in. Mm-hmm. Now, if that person comes to me and we have a conversation about their goals, about what hurts or what we're trying to do, and then I have them go over and I have them just do a body weight squat, and they maybe hit parallel, something like that. But within 5 minutes of Neubie pad placement, of just explaining how they can push their thorax back and bring their arms forward, and it's okay to round your back in a body weight squat. Like, we're not doing a maximum barbell squat here. Mm-hmm. We're just trying to restore a resting squat to someone. I find that is my biggest bang for the buck, to have all of this. Because once the person starts squatting, now it looks a whole lot like we're working out. And that's generally what the person comes to do. And so, even if you're working with someone who does have an injured limb or something, and they can body weight squat with Neubie on, I mean, anyone who's got a Neubie knows that you can get a heck of a workout squatting for 5 minutes, and maybe you stand on wedges, maybe we definitely probably going to take shoes off, like all that stuff. I don't want to get too deep into it.
Yeah. I think we talked about some of that on our last podcast.
We did indeed. Yeah. We did indeed. And that should be the same. You'll hear carryover, because I've been following and using Pat's stuff for 6 years, 7 years. Like, it is the core of what I do every day, like I said.
And you've been kind of the bridge that connected us, you and Matt Cooper also.
Trying to be, yeah.
So we were at a seminar, Pat Davidson seminar. It was cool. I got to work it into this recent trip out to LA, and it was at Matt Cooper's facility.
Yes. Shout out Matt Cooper.
Yes.
What's the Full Throttle Fitness?
Rewire.
Rewire HP.
Rewire.
On Instagram, Full Throttle Fitness.
Full circle.
Full Circle Fitness.
Is the facility? Yeah.
Yeah. If you're in Segundo or LA.
That's right. So let's stick on this notion of sagittal plane. So so you like the squat because it's very sagittal plane, flexion, extension.
Absolutely.
So that's good.
It's easy to teach a breathing pattern too. We've built breathing, which is the basis of the seminar we went to, into a movement that is. Pat's got a good saying: "You kill one stone, two birds." That's what we're trying to do.
So I one comment on that before we get back into the sagittal plane. So since going to that seminar, I've been doing, in the morning, I often get on my wedges and just get down into a squat. I'm working on restoring that position, and I already had been doing it, and now doing it, really focusing on expanding posterior expansion as I inhale.
Yeah.
It's changed the feeling of it, and it's been a really cool sensory experience.
Absolutely.
For me, and it's helped me get deeper into a squat also. So that's been a cool breakthrough in my personal practice and progression there.
In my opinion, and I will not run off on a tangent in this stuff carries far into nervous system calmness, parasympathetic nature, being a parasympathetic person, being a sympathetic person. Like, I find these changes as we progress someone along. And that's another reason why I think the big bang for the buck, unless you obviously have something prohibiting your deep squat, then that's probably your step number one.
Well, there is, we'll get back to sagittal plane too, I promise. But there is, on that, I'm glad you mentioned that, because there is a strong connection between, and Dr. Pat in the seminar and on the podcast talked about people being more biased towards inhalation or exhalation.
Yes.
And inhalation, of course, is more associated with higher sympathetic activity. Exhalation, more with parasympathetic activity.
Correct.
So there is certainly a bias in one direction or the other, and by changing that breathing, it's a two-way street. Right. You can influence the autonomic nervous system. So I just wanted to connect that dot real quick.
Yeah, well, and I think it's important that you do have to go both ways.
Yeah.
Regardless of if the person is exhaled or inhaled.
Yeah.
You're going to have to go back and forth. Yeah. You can't just take an inhaled person and just work exhalation all the time, because you'd probably die. You have to inhale.
Yes, you do need both. You can spend a little more emphasis on the one where there's a greater need in the beginning, and eventually you want to be proficient at all ends.
Absolutely.
Of the spectrum.
Absolutely.
So back to the sagittal plane. We talked about how the biggest issue is the center of mass. So if you're looking at someone from the side, that means center of mass is coming forward. It's usually in the form of, say, an anterior pelvic tilt, or the ribs kind of flaring forward.
Right.
And so the two kind of biggest, the motor, if you talk about competency in the checklist and being able to grade, like, yes, that passes, or yes or no, that fails. Being able to grade movement in that plane, it's controlling the center of mass vertically, but it's not just seeing that plumb line, it's also how you do it. So,
correct.
So that coaching cue of being able to use the hamstrings to pull on the ischial tuberosity to bring the pelvis back, if it's anterior tilted, to bring it back to a more neutral,
correct.
Posterior into a neutral position, using the internal obliques to hold down the ribs so they don't flare up and excessively arch the spine.
Correct.
Right. So, one question, you mentioned using it on the lower abs and the VMO. Do you also use the Neubie on, for example, on the hamstrings and the internal obliques, since those are the ones that he specifically mentioned in the podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in my practices that I see, we'll just say Instagram, of people where their pad placement is in Neubie, I see a lot of people on the lower traps working on the shoulder from the back and all these things, and that's generally great. But oftentimes in this conversation that we're having about restoring flexion, I find putting a lot more abs on the anterior side, so that I can kind of, when your muscles contract under Neubie, and this is another thing, just to be somewhat specific on Neubie, I think there's a contracting versus lengthening conversation here, which relates to frequency.
And also, I would say, using the Neubie for assistance or resistance.
Absolutely.
Sometimes too. So,
Yes.
so please continue.
Yes, and a lot of times I'm using it for assistance at first.
Yeah.
Because, and that's where you're talking like a 500 setting or something like that. But like the diaphragm specifically, I find, especially on like the exhalation and feeling abs when you breathe and using your abs, very few people put it in the sternum on those internal obliques. And I think that that's very beneficial because people don't necessarily know how to feel
So
those.
you're talking about infrasternal, just beneath the sternum, along
like
those, like the uppermost attachment
absolutely,
of the ribs,
absolutely.
right beneath those
I like to
diaphragm
call it we're taking the infrasternal angle, and in general, I want to be able to restore a line down the infrasternal angle, which would obviously require you to internally rotate the floating ribs and have those abs turn on there. So that's the big, I think, thing with Neubie that the pad placement does. If I have a Neubie on the back and I'm trying to restore this squat into this flexion state, now we're resistancing. Like if someone's already pretty strong and I want to get them to really pull in there, then I'm going to put some pads on the back.
Yeah.
But if someone's walking around in this fully extended position and I want to assist them, might be a lot more beneficial to put some pads on the front.
Yeah.
And by the way, when you do that, your client's you're gonna feel really how sensitive that is, and they're gonna because that's gonna cramp really fast.
Yeah, and that's also a great place, in our, level one sort of foundational. Originally called Level 1, now I believe it's called the Foundational Techniques course. When we do our versions of manual therapy that complement the Neubie, and of course other people can do other things, but we do a lot of work around along the sternum and then along the infrasternal ribs along there where the diaphragm attaches and things like that, because that Dr. Pat had a great saying. He called that sort of the original sin compensation.
Yeah.
I think it's also both locally and globally very important there, because a lot of times, we know this stereotypical protective response. If something's flying at me, I'm going to bring my arms in front of my body and use these hard bones here to protect the more vulnerable areas and of my organs and my face and head and everything. And then also, if I perceive stress coming at me, metaphorically, I also will have that same sort of those same sort of tension patterns can be in there. And so working on those, yes, you can get greater movement locally, but it also can help shift the body out of a more protective pattern globally and have far-reaching effects. So I like those pad placements. I think working there is super valuable.
I think you can also, there's oftentimes I'll do this, and it just a quick addition to that. When you internally rotate those ribs, this is something you experienced at the seminar. It created, when you bring the axial skeleton backwards, it will create space in your hips and in your shoulders so that then they can relax. And so oftentimes, like I said, I'm a personal trainer. So somebody might come in, I got this shoulder, I can't overhead press. Well, if we restore that squat, sometimes that shoulder works fine. And it's just a neurological problem in that shoulder. And I may not have even put pads on there. I may still need to, but it'll be more revealing of everything else as well.
Yeah, if you're able to go upstream and find the original root cause of the problem, sometimes that first domino will take care of it. Whereas sometimes you do have to go downstream to the shoulder itself.
Right. Absolutely.
So before we move on to other applications, while we're still in the sagittal plane, the P.R.I. paradigm. So a lot of Dr. Pat's, he sort of has this system, strongly influenced by P.R.I.
Definitely.
Postural Restoration Institute, strongly influenced by Bill Hartman, the physical therapist who he also mentioned. So this is coming from different places. So like the P.R.I. progression, oftentimes, people are in this 90-90 position. So not like a shin box 90-90 with hip internal external, but sitting, lying supine with your feet up on like a chair or a bench. So your shins are horizontal, femurs vertical, torso horizontal.
Correct.
So that 90-90. So people, start in that position. You're talking about starting in a squat here. Are you doing any of that 90-90, or are you essentially starting in a squat and thinking you can accomplish the same?
If I need to. right? Like that goes back to that thing where, let's say the person can't squat and we're doing this, but what if I have them like go over in front of my stall bars and like hang on to the stall bars? Oh, well, now all of a sudden you can squat all the way down. As long as I gave you something to hang on to, what's that hanging on to the bars going to do? That's going to displace the mass backwards, because now that person's able to feel their heels because they're going to hang on to something. So in order for me to do that, you're either going to have to be a pretty high level person that's kind of expecting that, or someone who's, so, like, I know that we're very limited in what we can do. Like you just had some sort of knee thing or something like that. So I will do the breathing, I will do the 90-90 stuff. What I actually do with that is I turn it more into a press. So take this same exact description that you just gave. Put your heels up onto a box, you're supine on the ground, you're driving your heels into the box so that you can nutate the pelvis. Let's counter nutation.
Posterior tilt.
Posterior tilting. I always confuse the nutation
Sacrum
and counter
nutation.
nutation. Yeah. So we're posterior tilting the pelvis, the head's back. I'll have them do a couple of breaths. Big exhalation focus, and then I'm going to bring 2 dumbbells over. And we're going to start like pressing from that 90-90 position, which now I'm getting the core thorax breathing. Might have them do that for 30 seconds or something like that. But then it's like, hey, let me bring you these 2 dumbbells. Now the person's got something to reach into. They can feel serratus, and now we can start building rotation in that person, even though that person may not be competent enough to stand up and say, like, throw a baseball or something like that. That's more complicated rotation, right? This is that idea of high ground he talked about. So it's like a great way. Let's someone's got a bad shoulder. We still got to do some upper body in a personal training session. So if I do this 90-90 with the feet up, giving them the ground. Now they've got their ground on the feet. They've got their ground on the hamstrings. I might have Neubie on too.
So ground, for everyone listening, is this concept of not the physical ground, although that can be. It can be.
Yeah.
But it's this notion of physical support and also neurological feedback. So
Absolutely.
Think about doing a squat on a Bosu ball versus doing a squat in a Smith machine.
Yes.
Where not only are you on solid ground, but you
Or
also
leg press.
You also have that stability, or a leg press, which is even more.
Right.
Yeah, that sort of
The
thing.
more external cues.
External support is the word I was looking
Cues
for.
and support.
Yeah.
So I would say like Neubie falls under that question of, is the Neubie a cue or is it a support?
Yeah.
Because it could be a cue because they can feel the muscle that I want them to use.
Right.
Or it could be support where it's actually moving something into position with a contraction.
Either way, it adds ground to the exercise.
Absolutely.
And so his notion of increasing ground so that you can make it much more likely that you're going to hit the target muscle, right?
Right. The person, when we do that press, the person gets very tired in their serratus, they get very tired in the pec, they get very tired in the hamstrings, all these target tissues that we're trying to hit. And I, without even this idea of Pat's of high ground is like new, but I named the gym grounded strength because I find if we're squatting, pressing, whatever, the more the person can feel the ground or where their feet are, now they know what's happening upstream.
Yeah.
That's that kind of original sin conversation. I hear a lot of people say that in different ways. I've heard an airway dentist say that the original sin is the airway. Gary Ward, who's been on the podcast, says the original sin's the foot. Pat says it's the infrasternal angle. I don't care which.
Yeah.
I just want to make them all match and be able to go back and forth.
Thank you so much for listening to the Undercurrent podcast. If you're interested in learning more about how NeuFit and the Neubie can impact your life, please visit our website at www.new.fit, that's NEU.FIT, so you can learn more about how it might integrate into your professional practice, how you can use it as a patient, and you can also connect with our team there.
That's right. They all need to be proficient.
That's absolutely true.
Yeah. So I like that approach. Let's transition from the sagittal plane conversation, talking to the frontal plane conversation. So this is something that was in your section of the athletic performance course. You talked a lot about, and this is influenced by P.R.I. and other similar schools of thinking, but there's this notion that for good, effective human movement, it's necessary to be able to put one's center of mass fully over one leg,
Right.
and then switch, lateralize fully over to the other leg.
Correct.
To go back and forth for effective running, for effective rotational movement. Think about winding up for a pitch or a baseball swing or a golf swing, this sort of thing. So talk to me about your thoughts on how you can use the Neubie to improve this sensory motor competency in the frontal plane.
Now you can get really fun and you can get really complicated here. Pat talked about that mirror asymmetry, and used the statue of David. So I mean, you can, and we do this with some of our older, less capable clients. You can just have them stand and shift their weight. One of the best ways I figured out how to do this is if you have someone standing on 2 feet, and it's probably something Pat said at some point, so I don't know if I heard it somewhere else, but probably you, Pat. If you just stand there and someone's standing on 2 feet, make them take a foot away and tell them not to move their head. You can't. You'll never be able to do it. You're going to shift your head over the 1 foot that you're standing on. So if you are in...
By the way, a really good cue for this is that notion of like making 1 foot lighter, 1 foot heavier.
The heavy leg gain.
If you're 50-50, going 51-49, 52-48, 60-40, 70-30, just gradually shifting more and more weight onto one and off the other is a good cue for everyone listening to play around with that.
Yeah. And so when you're doing this, you know, there's a... Pat talks about, we didn't touch on it, I don't want to get too deep into it because it can be another one of these wormholes, but like the helical rotation of motion, like the way the body works in these helical ways. So if you can imagine taking Neubie pads and making a internal external rotation and the muscles involved in that process, you could place the pads there. And
so sort of like a Myers spiral line.
Bingo.
Sort of anatomical structure,
Absolutely. You could just have them stand on that leg. One of the things that we do is like we'll put a slider behind them and have them work on that. But it always ends up in this lateralization of the hip, where the head moves over the inside of the foot. He talked about the sternum, the belly button, and the zipper all being over the big toe on 1 foot. Well, of course, that side that you're on, that's a supinated foot, that's an externally rotated hip, that's probably a down, probably slightly up rib cage because you're going to be reaching back over there. You're going to be pronated.
That's if you're adding in the transverse plane. If you're talking frontal plane, it would just be compressed.
Well, that's an interesting trick when you talk to Pat Davidson, because the frontal plane and the transverse plane kind of go together.
Yes.
And then so that frontal plane presentation that you're talking about, and we talked about this before, but that's going to be a pure frontal plane presentation.
Frontal plane, pure frontal plane, and most, virtually all sporting movements are going to have them combined.
Right.
Pure frontal plane would be like if you're on what are those things called, slide board, where you're like doing hockey skaters.
You're still going to be moving your hands. Yeah. So it's still going to be somewhat transverse
that's fair.
plane.
Okay.
But the transverse plane requires the frontal plane. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
You cannot have a transverse plane without a frontal plane.
Yeah.
And so we talked about and Pat talked about the Jacksonian disillusionment, where you take like a sick person and bring them back to being an athlete. That pure frontal plane presentation is that penguin walk that you see, where there's no rotation, there's no sagittal plane, it's just frontal plane. Then that's what we were talking about, so you want to restore the sagittal plane. When we move into transverse and frontal plane and athletic movements, that's where Pat, I've heard him say this many times, that's where Bill Hartman gets to, there's only the transverse plane. Everything is transverse plane. But you do have to have that frontal plane, which is what you're talking about, which is that hip shift on the slide board.
And I know that's probably going to be a leading question, but I know you've talked about, this notion from P.R.I, at least I credit them, it's where I've learned from, this notion that as humans, we have natural asymmetries, liver's on one side, stomach on the other, different lobes and volume of lungs on each side, heart on one side, right? And so it tends to bias humans into a position where they tend to lateralize more to the right, typically are more comfortable loading the right leg than the left. And you I know you have some interesting patterns and pad placements and approaches with the Neubie to help people learn to more effectively load their left side. So
Correct.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Correct. Yeah, that's the, keeping in mind the image we were just talking about, right? So we're talking about, in your slide board image, we're talking about lateralizing left. That's going to be less common. Left-handed athlete is less common. Left-handed athlete in many sports is like a cheat code because we are right-handed. And there's a really interesting conversation that is 90-something% of the world right-handed because the world teaches us to be right-handed, or because we have a liver over there? So it's more beneficial by like 3 or 4 pounds to be pulled to that side. Generally, I believe it's the latter. I believe that the liver pulls us over to that side. So if I'm going to lateralize over there, I need if I'm whichever side I'm lateralizing to, I need VMO on that side. I need that foot to be supinated. I need a glute medius on that side. I need lower trap. And on the other side, which is the most interesting thing, that if I'm lateralizing left, Pat mentioned it's the push side that really helps the most. So if I'm going to lateralize left, actually pronating right is your driving force. So it might be getting the right arch to drop, which is really going to push me over to that left side, which is what you're talking about. Where if we're lateralized right, I'm generally externally rotated on the right. Generally, more commonly, the right foot is a little supinated, but it's also the push-off foot. So the more athletic the person is, you're going to have this pronated foot because that's what they push off of. And you see that all the time in basketball athletes and stuff like that. But that's where, when an injury happens, you're going to lose some of that lateralization. And either way, let's say you have an injury on the right side, the person's going to depend more on their left side for that. If they haven't practiced that over time, there's a good chance they're going to have now a catastrophic injury on the left side because they don't understand that process and how to get back to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's and so lateralizing to the left, or rather, a good way to put this is, when I'm training someone, I want to make sure that they have competency on their left side. So even if we're talking about that sagittal plane squat that we started talking about, I want to make sure that person can feel their left hamstring and their left abs more than their right hamstring and their right abs, because that's easier to feel. And generally, you get this hip shift over to the right in a squat, and so you can use Neubie pads to pull the person back left to feel that, so that now you can achieve that center of mass. And so that's a good tie-in. Like, your lateralization to the left, in my thought, is actually one of the ways that you can achieve the actual centering in the sagittal plane.
I like it. Let's pivot once more and talk specifically about the ribs. We've mentioned it a little bit, but this is an area where, I think there's, not as much. I hear people talking about. I of course have a limited perspective, right? But hear people talking about, like with golfers, for example, a lot of work wanting to increase thoracic rotation, and that's a noble endeavor, and there's value in that. But I think there's often not enough value placed on movement of the ribs themselves.
Right.
So it's very important for a rotational movement, and generating power in any sort of rotational movement, which of course is almost anything in sports. I played hockey to be able to shoot the puck.
Right.
Hit a baseball, swing a baseball bat, swing a golf club.
Absolutely.
Throw a punch.
Absolutely.
The ribs are important. So talk to us about working with the ribs. And we talked about it a little bit in terms of keeping the ribs in a proper position.
Sure.
In sagittal plane, but specifically more in the frontal and transverse planes.
Sure. So the big, if we're talking rotation, we're talking athletics, right? So let's just assume, for this purposes of this conversation, you've internally rotated the ribs, you've restored the squat, you've got the ribs in a decent sagittal plane position. Now I want to go start teaching the ribs to rotate independent of the thorax or of the pelvis. And what we're going to talk about there is kind of back to that space conversation. If I internally rotate the ribs, I'm going to create space in the shoulder. So we see a lot
So
of...
internally rotate is going to be, we talk about bucket handle or pump handle. That's going to be bucket handle down.
Correct.
That's going to be just to
when
just
I
make
get
sure
a
everyone
bucket
can
handle
see, because
down,
you're gesturing, but people listening wouldn't be able to see.
Yeah, sorry.
So.
When I get bucket handle down on the ribs, there's now, oftentimes in golf, I really like the golf example. There's videos of golfers that are on the Kaiser machine and they're pushing one side while they pull the other. So I think these contrasting push-pull motions are how you're going to teach the rib cage to move that way.
Yeah.
And so, again, if it may be an arm pad placement that you're talking about, but I think if you've got that if you've got those ribs internally rotated, you've got that squat restored, now you're talking arm movement is what causes the ribs to rotate. So in oftentimes that pushing, pulling thing.
Arm movement and also protraction, retraction of the scapula.
Bingo.
I mean, you're gesturing, and I'm just
Sorry.
filling in for people.
Yeah,
so I kind of help complete the
when
picture.
I push pull in a push motion, I'm gonna protract that scapula as far as I can protract.
Like you're throwing an exaggerated punch.
Correct. And I'm gonna retract the opposite side scapula as much as I can. I'm gonna take a few breaths there, and then I'm going to alternate that motion. If I do not have a proper rib cage, a proper thorax to do that, it's going to drastically limit the ability for me to protract. Oftentimes, I think we get into retracting the shoulder to protect the low back.
And that also is a common cue. People are like, "Oh, bring your shoulders down and back."
Absolutely.
And that is often not the right cue.
Correct. And it's almost, and you're doing it bilaterally at the same time, right? Which is just going to drive that person into more extension, into a more sympathetic nervous system. And so if we are protracting and really emphasizing that, that's going to give us these internal obliques. And it obviously down to the foot too. Now we're going to find some certain things. If I'm going to throw a punch with my left hand, I'm going to have my right hamstring pulling me, which is this mirror asymmetry thing. So the arms moving in a golf swing, you want to pull with that left arm rather than pushing with the right arm. And that's common cue in most golf teaching, that it's that, and oftentimes we see people overreach on that backswing. We get to that kind of David thing, the Bernini's David, where your hip has to stay to the side that you're going to, and your rib cage will then rotate to that side, so that now you pull back the other direction with your left hand, and now the rib cage will rotate as well to the other side. So I think that kind of answered it. It's just, you always have to go back to this sagittal plane competency. And if you have your ribs in an extended position because you're pulling both shoulders back, you're probably never going to find that sagittal plane competency. And I think that's what you're getting at the point where it all comes back to this anterior side, where if we're using Neubie or we're emphasizing that internal rotation of the ribs to protract the shoulders, we've now restored rotation into that person, unless they don't want rotation because they're a bodybuilder or a strongman or something like that.
Anti-rotation.
That's a whole nother conversation about, but and that's why I like this topic best. Talking about restoring movement, moving people back to general population, because oftentimes we're presented with people who can't do certain movements.
Right.
And when we get them back into general population, we always, I know you guys here, even though you all have physical therapists and chiropractors and everything at the clinic here, you still want to get people back into training and getting healthy.
Totally.
And that's where I think that's our like hammered point on this is Neubie does so much to restore that sagittal plane, which then you can move so much further in the other direction.
So on this movement where you're pressing forward with one arm, pulling, pressing and with one arm and rowing or pulling with the other.
Yeah.
How do you like to load that? I mean, I think you could stand with a cable machine facing away, press on one side concentrically as you kind of eccentrically go back on the other. You could do it the other way, pulling, like rowing on one side as you eccentrically load with the other.
Right.
Kind of do both.
I think cables are the most conducive to this, and it's if I'm working a push pull.
Yeah.
In our gym, I'm actually going to get one of those fancy cable things that Matt has. That's the flywheel deal.
Oh,
because I need
that was
dual.
Cool.
It was very cool because I need dual cables to do this.
Yeah.
And obviously, Kaiser machine's great for this. Any sort of dual cable pulley system, but if you only have a single cable, you can let the free hand just push and or pull, right? So if I'm set up facing a single arm cable, which is what I have in the gym, I might put a left foot forward and a right foot back, and then have the person right foot forward, left foot back, and have the person pulling with their right arm while I'm pushing the left with no weight. The cable's in the right hand here.
And to orient this, we're thinking the action should be like when you're running in the transverse plane, as your left leg comes forward, your right arm comes forward. So we got that counter rotation.
Correct. Yeah, I think we mentioned it multiple times in the athletic development seminar, but it's this contralateral idea.
Yeah.
That one side needs to be doing the complete opposite of what the other side is doing. And that's where you get to that checklist that he has, which is your certain muscles.
Yeah.
Can you feel the obliques on this side? Can you feel the glute medius on this side? Can you feel the adductor on this side? Can you feel the abductors on the other side?
Yeah.
And that's so whether you're setting it up as a push or a pull, you're still going to be doing this contralateral front-back stance in either place. And that's actually one of my favorite moves. Once I've taken the person off that supine press with the feet up on the box, now we'll come over, stand in that front-back stance, give them a left foot forward and a left arm forward, right arm back, right foot back, and then have them push with the right arm like you're throwing a punch, but pull that left arm back at the same time. And oftentimes people will try to push with the right arm, and then their wrist break, like the wrist opens up, that foot that you're on the toe to throw a good punch, it flattens out, the heel comes down. And so that pull from the left side helps to initiate the movement. I think the other point of this is whatever the side you're doing the action of, make sure you understand what the other side is doing in this case. Because if you're pushing the cable with the right arm, what's actually happening on your left side has a heck of a lot to do with allowing the shoulder to protract on the right side as you push.
And just anecdotally, I'll say after doing some of these with you, and then right before my next round of golf, I got to play a round of golf soon after this. My swing felt different. I felt like I had more rotational range of motion. Of course, I can create force through a greater distance. And, things felt smoother, better. So I mean, just anecdotally, the feeling, the subjective experience was cool. In terms of pad placement for something like this, are you still liking that? You going serratus? You like the serratus?
Sternum and serratus. Sternum and serratus.
And when you say sternum, you mean just beneath the sternum on the upper abs?
Correct. Yeah, like you've got your infrasternal angle. I mean, and they're just the upper abs. I don't know if there's a fancy word for that I don't know it if there is. But those upper abs and the serratus, and then come down to the internal obliques as well.
Nice. I love it.
And that's what you see. Like basically, it really is. I don't think we can hammer this enough. No one walking around with like the chest out cue, no one does that while they're playing sports unless you're an NFL offensive lineman. Like if you're an offensive lineman, you might do that, because you want to stop somebody from getting around you. But all other sports, hockey, wrestling, baseball, basketball, golf, they're not played with your chest up. And we get lost in the fitness world with that chest up, shoulders back. And a lot of times people have back pain and they're lifting weights, they're deadlifting, they're squatting, they're doing all these things that they should do, checking boxes. But it's that one shoulders back that's keeping them from allowing everything to come forward, which will help them find the middle of their foot, find their center of mass. And now you can go live your life from your center of mass, and it's going to be more beneficial.
Yeah.
Unless you're making millions of dollars being a strongman, in which case, more power to you. Or an NFL lineman.
That's right.
If you're a $70 million guy to protect, the quarterback's
Pat
left
Mahomes,
side, then, you're going to be a little stiff.
Shout out to Trey Smith with the Kansas City Chiefs,
Absolutely.
our guy.
Absolutely.
He's one of my favorite people. He's a good Neubie user and
Right.
even a better human being.
Well, in the conversations that when he retires and we restore him to a normal person versus what we need him to do to protect Pat Mahomes, these are deeply, deeply different conversations.
Yeah, that's true.
I think it's so important in Neubie, in the fitness world, that athleticism is not necessarily healthy.
Yeah.
It can be. There are healthy athletes. But quite often, if you've reached the level and you've been playing a professional sport for 10 years or even 5 years or, college, high school, all that, like health has kind of gone by the wayside. We're talking about like pure performance at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there is definitely in many cases, tension between that. It's a balance.
No question. No question.
Anything in life, you have to, anything you say yes to, you're saying no to something else. There's always no decisions, just trade-offs.
Yeah.
I
think that's important too as we talk about this, because I loved Pat's Socrates conversation about how nothing's ever perfect. I think that's also important as we relate to this topic. We're getting as close to the archetypes of these movements as we can. Mm-hmm. And if we can take someone to a place, back to our squat example, the person has never deep squatted. If you get that person into a deep squat using pad placements, using these breathing things, that person is going to be more sore than they have really ever been. And they're going to have a new window into exercise that is, now you can come back to do this, and they might not be able to get there on their own. So this is going to really open up the world to them and change a lot of things.
Yeah, for sure. I love that. I think that's a great note on which to begin winding down here.
Absolutely.
Thank you for coming by. Where can people find Grounded Strength? Tell us the website.
ATX. GroundedStrengthATX.com, at Grounded Strength ATX on Instagram. The Instagram is a bit sparse. We're going to keep building that up.
Yeah, very good.
I often make them we won't call it a mistake. I often have the tendency, I get focused in my work and trying to help my clients rather than create new content. Right. And I need to be better about that. But Grounded Strength ATX at either place.
Awesome. Thank you so much, my friend. Appreciate you coming back on.
It's a pleasure. I hope to be back in many other ways, and I love what you're doing here. These are the people that have newbies that are listening to this podcast are truly what I believe to be the game-changing people in this industry. And I think that these strategies are only going to help people in their own pursuits. And I really hope that these really smart people that have these newbies start experimenting and come back with stuff, because I want to learn from them too.
I love it when our guest makes a better closing statement than I ever would have made myself. Beautiful note on which to end it. So thank you, everybody, for tuning into this episode. Please remember to like, subscribe, do all that stuff on your favorite platform, and we will see you on the next episode.